you'd have to say this is a bit of an own goal for Putin, because for hardly any advance of, maybe flattening one village or two, he has awarded Ukraine a huge diplomatic victory, which hadn't happened at any time in the war until this point, which is that they can now use Western weapons to strike into Russia. For them, that is a big step forward.
Well, first of all, George, just give us a sense of the significance of the Dnipro River and the bridgehead that Ukraine managed to establish some time ago and has been defending ever since.
That's right. So when we think of the front lines in Ukraine, we tend to think of kind of it all happening over the land, of trenches, a kind of First World War style sort of front line. Well, actually, it extends to the Dnipro River. So yes, there is a long stretch of sort of trenches and all that sort of classic front line that you might imagine. But there's also the river that divides Ukraine in two, and the Dnieper runs all the way down from the north of Ukraine, kind of near Kiev, all the way down to the Black Sea. And towards the Black Sea, the southern end of it, there was a time at the beginning of the conflict where the Russians managed to sort of advance over onto the right bank, so onto the western side, onto the Ukrainian side. That proved untenable. They were driven out of there, you might remember, during the Kherson counteroffensive in 2022. And since that point, you've basically had these two sides camped on opposite sides of the river. Last October, the Ukrainians they managed to establish a beachhead and sort of made these small forays across the river to sort of establish some territory on the left bank of the river. Now, it's very hard to hold that position, obviously, because they're totally surrounded by Russian-controlled area, and to get to where they need to get to, they have to go by boat across the river. But they are just about holding on, but it's turned out to be a pretty bloody battle.
Yeah, just tell me a bit more about the challenges of maintaining that beachhead and potentially trying to make further progress, which so far they haven't been able to make. They've established it at this place called Kharkiv. What are the challenges they're facing?
So the terrain is not just the main river itself. There's also tributaries, there's marsh. It's a pretty hellish environment to be fighting in. And as soon as you get onto a boat and start crossing out into the river, you can imagine you're quite visible to sort of Russian drones. So the challenge is to kind of speed across as quickly as possible, get to the other side without being seen. But quite possibly you'll come under kind of a hellfire of shelling and drones as you try and make your way across there. And then, as you can imagine, once you're there, you're going to face the equal challenge of getting back if you need to get back, if there are any casualties or anything, but also supplies. So actually they tend to use drones mostly to go across. But the longer that they've been there, it's not a particularly large place. And so the Russians have basically flattened it with glide bombs and with artillery shells. And that means that there's hardly any cover for Ukrainian soldiers to hide in. Sorry, Mike.
That's all right. And is Kharkiv the only beachhead they've been able to establish so far?
Yes, but within, there have been attempts it's certainly the most permanent presence they've had on that side of the bank, put it that way, since they sort of started making these little attempts to cross. But they are in a very tricky situation. Like I said, it's very hard to maintain supplies, and basically, if they hoped that this would just be a kind of the brief launching pad for a kind of a bigger drive, a bigger push into Russian territory, it hasn't turned that out that way. And the more they become bogged down, the more they can be kind of picked off, because the Russians know there's a very small area where they can land and come into, and they can sort of throw out absolutely everything at them.
Now, George, you've just got back from Ukraine. You've written a brilliant dispatch for the Times. Just tell us about some of the conversations you were having with the Ukrainians out there.
Yeah, so we went to one of their kind of bases, which is where you kind of have a big bank of screens where you can see a kind of live drone feed of from multiple different angles of the view of the battlefield. And, the impression was of people who were exhausted, overworked. Ukraine at the moment is going through a big mobilization drive because over 2 years now, 2.5 years into the war, the concern is that they're running out of willing troops to fight. And there was certainly the impression from speaking to these people that they were They were overworked, and just imagine how grueling these rotations of about a month are on the left bank, where you're totally surrounded by Russian troops. Totally, any movement could be picked up by a drone, and there's no easy way back. It's a very psychologically grueling and isolating place to fight.
And really interestingly, the Ukrainians have been receiving training from the Royal Marines in Britain in order to help them with things like crossing the Dnipro and establishing beachheads.
That's right. So when they made that original counter-offensive around Kherson, a few months after that, they realised, well, if we need to push further, we've got to make these kind of amphibious landings. This is not something the Ukrainians were. Well, I mean, they had some experience, but nothing like the Royal Marines, which is over 350 years of doing this sort of specialised fighting. And so a lot of Ukrainian troops benefited from this sort of 5-week training package that involved, practical skills like how do you swim in body armor? How do you not panic if your boat gets capsized? How do you flip it back over the right way around and sort of continue where you need to go and avoid drowning? These were the sort of practical skills that they were sort of put through at a number of army and navy bases in the UK during that 5-week training program.
What do you think would make the difference for Ukraine in terms of making progress on the left side of the Dnipro?
It's a very, very complicated operation. Arguably, what they are doing there is similar to what the Russians have done around Kharkiv, which is to sort of draw troops away from the main fight, force the Russians to shuffle their resources around. It's a very, very complicated option. There's a reason why the Russians decided to withdraw from the other side of the river, which is that the river is a very defensible position, and it makes it very hard to supply once you have some sort of territory on the other side. Absent, the delivery and the final arrival of Western fighter jets, that's the kind of game changer that they might be hoping for. In terms of, sorry, my camera's just lit again. That's the arrival of Western fighter jets would make a difference anywhere on the battlefield, particularly if we think about how the Russians are currently able to drop glide bombs, which is what they have been doing on Kharkiv in particular, kind of flattening it. Unless you have Western fighter jets, you can't really battle against that because it's very hard to intercept glide bombs. The only way of taking them down is air-to-air missiles fired by another fighter jet.
Yeah, that is a key question at the moment, when the long-awaited F-16 fighter jets will finally come online. Do we have any update on that?
It's a closely guarded secret, and you can understand why. There are rumors already circulating that some might be in Ukraine, some might be coming any second now. I think the kind of the realistic side of things is that we might not see any in active combat until at the end of the year, but it also wouldn't surprise us for the Ukrainians to kind of deploy them and then announce that they had already entered the battle after the fact, because it's a way of maintaining that element of surprise.
And just finally, George, you mentioned the offensive that Russia has been launching in the northeast of Ukraine recently in Kharkiv Oblast. Is there a sense that that is now stalled?
Yeah, that's petered out. The Americans were pretty confident they were confident enough to say that it's all but over. That is thanks to this approval that President Biden gave for the Ukrainians to use Western and American weapons to hit into Russian territory. So Kharkiv and neighbouring Sumy, where I was just about a week ago, both of them border Russia. And the concern was that Russia was able to hide its ammunition dumps and everything within Russia, and the Ukrainians couldn't hit them with their Western weapons because they weren't allowed. Now they can, and you'd have to say this is a bit of an own goal for Putin, because for hardly any advance of maybe flattening one village or two, he has awarded Ukraine a huge diplomatic victory, which hadn't happened at any time in the war until this point, which is that they can now use Western weapons to strike into Russia. For them, that is a big step forward.